Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my real room, guys. Hope you're well today. Today we're going to be talking about INFJs and the sense of self, and which may include, in fact, INTJs as well. But as you'll see, the way I explain it in the video a little bit later on, in the case of INTJs, I'm almost more wondering what INTJs think, because I'm not under the skin and not in the skin and body of an INTJ. I just think that it would be interesting to look at this question of INFJ's sense of self from within the framework of the distinction between the self and the ego, right? And you'll see why what I'm getting at here, and hopefully you will relate, because there's certainly a sense estrangement from self and complications and challenges that are attendant to it. Something that I'm not a stranger to, and I'm curious if any of you guys have experienced that as well. And before I move on, don't forget that you can get my book, The Ecstatic Soul, which is, deepest investigation of the INFJ you can find online. Get it on Amazon for less than $10, ebook paperback format. And if you're interested in fiction, you can also support my channel by getting The Infinite Castle, which is a very nice product. It's a book of existentialism, influenced by Dostoevsky, Kafka, Camus. If you like these authors, want to support me, it's also less than $10. And the more I get reviews on this book, the more the reviews suggest that the main character is an INFJ. So, I alienated INFJ from a fictional perspective. If you're interested, really supports my channel. And also, finally, you can support me on Patreon, anywhere from €3 a month. That is very deeply appreciated. It helps the channel massively, by the way, so I could keep it going. Okay, so what am I getting at with this whole notion of the sense of self? One of the many interesting things that Carl Jung has said, talked about, is that it is important for people to distinguish between the self and the ego. And if I were to, provide a very, a portrait, the distinction in very broad brushstrokes, you could more or less say the following. You could say that the self is the entirety of what you are, and it has a transcendent quality to it, whereas the ego is very much connected to the world of the terrestrial world of the everyday, and is concerned with such things as reputation, what others think about their status, their career, all those preoccupations. I think that Kierkegaard would probably distinguish between a sense of the ethical, that would be kind of like a predecessor to Carl Jung's sense of self, and the aesthetic. Aesthetic is an aesthetic man in the very kind of peculiar vocabulary of Kierkegaard is someone who is basically completely lost in the vagaries of his ego. And we have a situation in the modern world, perhaps more than any other era before, where there is a cult of the ego. Everything, there is an unholy partnership, implied partnership between the machine of modern day neo-capitalism and the cultivation of the ego. And as we have come to know, this is the cause, and the trigger and the cause of many neuroses for people nowadays, because the more they fall into this, the more they become disconnected from the sense of the transcendent. And the sense of the transcendent is something that I've been talking about quite a bit in my videos lately. So that is very good. Now, what I think is interesting about the INFJ is that we are in a paradoxical situation. We're in a paradoxical situation because on one hand, we are peculiarly equipped to have an acute awareness that we indeed have a self, and that we ought to connect back to the self. The reason why we do have this acute awareness is related primarily to the function of introverted intuition, because introverted intuition puts us in touch. What I like to call the perception of inner contents. Inner contents are inner archetypes. But if you were to consider the totality of the experience of these archetypes? Well, this is the self. So in other words, there is a very strong implied presence of the self in what we perceive in this inner way. Hence, these ideas, and we see them, obviously translated into different terms in Buddhism and other religions. The idea that the self itself is not necessarily embodied, that it's transcendent, that it's eternal, that it's timeless. This is so you see that there's a lot of common traits between an archetype and what the self is. So on the one hand, INFJs are peculiarly equipped to access this kind of awareness. On the other hand, the very fact that society nowadays, the way it's run and the way it promotes itself and maintains itself, is so predicated on the promotion and the celebration of the ego that it is hard for everybody not to fall into the traps of egoic behaviors and egoic, everyday existence, basically. And that goes for INFJs too. And I think that the challenge for INFJs is that, in a way, they suffer from a double predicament. I think they have, on the one hand, the same ego-related issues that other people have, but they also have this awareness that there's something that ought to be surpassed in order to attain the self. And they have this awareness not in the sense of reading self-help books about it, because you'll find a lot of self-help books talking about, transcending your ego and so on. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, by the way. But I think that INFJs experience this at a much more intimate level. It's part of their everyday experience. This constant sense that in some way or other, even though they are allowing the ego to dominate, they are in some sense betraying their sense of self. They're betraying their self. There's almost a moral quandary here that is experienced by INFJs. It's kind of in the background. So we're back to this notion of authenticity. INFJs are very sensitive to authenticity, but part of why they're very sensitive to authenticity is because they're constantly themselves battling with a notion that they're not being authentic to themselves as they could be. So in a way, it's a double predicament, because you could argue that in the case of other types, perhaps that are not very strong on NI, the issues surrounding the ego are kind of self-contained. So the issues are there, and the battle has to be waged there, and maybe they can get help, so on. But they're not necessarily going to have this super, very innermost awareness of this self that's knocking at the door, not being respected, and the struggle to find a place for it. And therefore, they're not going to be as much in a moral predicament as to how to be authentic to their sense of self, even though they end up being authentic to it. They don't have this constant experiential awareness that this is going on. And so I think, this is difficult for the INFJ, because they have to negotiate the ego, but they also have to negotiate the demands of the self and the call of conscience and the kind of critical voice that says, what are you doing? You're not living according to your innermost self. And I think it will be the case, that more than one INFJ has experienced the idea of saying, I will live according to my true authentic self. I've got it. I'm going to do it. And then, it turns out to be too difficult in today's society, and there are too many temptations and too many pleasures and too many attractions and too many demands. And, ego takes over, and there's not only the neurosis that is coming with that, but also a certain sense of guilt, it's not having been able to heed, the rightful demands of the self. So how to surpass that, how to transcend that, how to actually achieve, whether we call it ego dissolving, or at least allowing ego to step aside and relax while the self takes over. This whole challenge could be the challenge of a lifetime, certainly worth exploring. But in the meantime, that's what the double predicament I had in mind was for this video, and I'd be curious if you have any thoughts on this, guys. Let me know in the comments, and don't forget you can support me on Patreon. That really helps. Okay, see you. Bye-bye.